Howe. Welcome again to another installment of Latin pronunciation and conversation. I'm really glad you're here. So, what we're going to talk about today is the sound of letter H in Latin. And so this has become controversial a bit due to, it would seem, the prevalence still, I think, in Spain, in universities, of teaching that this sound in Latin by the classical Latin period wasn't there anymore. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to look at the evidence. So the simple answer is, how does H sound in Latin? It's H as in English. That's the voiceless glottal fricative in the IPA symbol. That's what this is, as in English and as in German. There's a reason that English and German and other languages, of course, use the letter H to represent H, and it is because it has its origins in the pronunciation of Latin, even during the Roman Empire. So we're going to address a little bit here, and like I said, there are some Spanish YouTubers who make some really great videos, but they actually were saying that the sound of H was completely gone by the Republican period, that is by the late Republican period, so the 1st century BC. And that's the classical Latin, that's Cicero and that's Caesar. That's the pronunciation that we often aim for, with certainly some possibilities into the 1st century AD, as well as the 2nd century AD, since that's classical Latin. So there's a lot of possibilities here. And I can definitely tell you there were certainly people who were fluent Latin speakers. And to my best guess, they would probably not pronounce the H all the time, such as in varieties of rustic Latin or other variations. But the sound of H is certainly something that is pronounced. Now, we really can't go to any better source for classical Latin than Cicero, right? So how did Cicero actually pronounce or say things? That's often what we go for. We all would love to talk like Cicero, write like Cicero, because that's sort of the foundation. I mean, I kind of like Apuleius in a lot of ways, but certainly Cicero, by definition, is completely Latin. There's nothing that sways or nothing that strays from the core of what classical Latin is, if it's not Cicero, right? And Caesar. So that's the gold standard of Latin. So if they're doing something, it should be okay. Now, he says, qui nego ipse, cum scira ita maiores locutos, nusquam nisien vocali aspirationi uterentur, loque barsicut pulcros, cetegos, triumpos, and so forth. So he's talking about here, it's interesting, it's quoted by Sidney Allen too in the Vox Latina book, which is, of course, very good. I disagree with a couple things, as you know, but is excellent for mid-20th century scholarship on the topic, that book. But he cites this as to demonstrate that Cicero was not pronouncing sepulchra or coronas. Oops, I didn't need to do that. Or Carthaginem, or Carthaginem with that kind of aspiration, or triumpos, or pulchros. He wasn't adding an H sound. He wasn't adding aspiratio to consonants, but that he would only ever do it in a vowel. That's what he says here. He would never do it unless it was on a vowel. He is saying that on vowels, he pronounces the letter H. So like mihi, honore, honos. But he wouldn't say carta, he would say carta. Now he goes on later to say that he has taken on the habits of what most people do. And so the whole passage is very interesting. It's talking about comparing like burrum instead of, which is what Ennius wrote apparently, instead of burrum, which was more common. But definitely not, he wouldn't say thermae, he would say thermae, he would say pilosopus and not pilosopus, and so forth. So we'll talk about all that. So the point is that we have direct attestation of not just one excellent grammarian, scholar, author, namely Cicero, who's demonstrating that the aspiratio is part of the language. And that he's criticizing, because the idea that I've seen the bad information, shall I call it, that's being given is that H was absolutely not pronounced, except perhaps in the most elite circles. Well, no, because Cicero here, who is definitely not super... he's elite from our perspective, but he was critical, as is Catullus over here, of people who aimed to try to add certain things that are elitist sounding, like adding aspirations, using the Greek letter, he says here, U, the Graikam literam, U adibebant, instead of doing U, which is the native Latin vowel, because U is not a native Latin vowel. So he's critical of these upper class things, right? So it's demonstrative that he's obviously exactly the model that we imitate. Certainly we could imitate people who weren't pronouncing the H consistently or well. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that because it seems to be consistent with at least some native speakers. And certainly we don't have to all speak totally urban Roman Latin. We can speak with whatever, accents and so forth we might like to take from the ancient period. The point, though, is that H is pronounced, and we have Quintilian talking about aspiratione, and talking about specifically, actually, the word that I started with, which was have. Like he talks about how avere should be wrong, that it should be have, because it shouldn't be a verb at all. It should be have, because it's taken right from Carthaginian, have. And there's a ha, of course, and perhaps obviously in the Punic language. So there you go. People are liquid. Energia. So the pronunciation of H is thus. The reason that people are using their linguistic ideas think that H isn't pronounced is because nemo comes from ne homo, and that the H spelling is archaic. Well, again, as I demonstrated, the H is talked about here as being a thing, as a pronunciation in the language. So this is 1st century BC, this is 1st century AD. We'd easily go to grammarians of the 2nd century AD and later, and we still find that they're talking about it, about the sound of h as the H, as if it's still a thing. And certainly they could be critical of certain groups that might not be pronouncing it. But when grammarians criticize something, it doesn't mean that they're trying to push some kind of artificial thing. It's not at all what it means. And those have to be taken case by case. Of course, the Catullus poem, which is very famous, Comodo dicebant, si quando commoda vellet, dicret insidias, Arius insidias. Making fun of Arius, saying insidias instead of insidias. Now he's making fun of them, not fun of him, number one, because of course the H sound is perceived. It's not like it doesn't exist. For example, Italians do not natively perceive this, and they get this wrong consistently. This fellow was doing the same thing, and he was also adding H's to commoda instead of simply commoda, seemingly an imitation of Greek, because there were a lot of, apparently it was in fashion, contemporary with Catullus. We have Cicero who's talking about how people were doing this, adding these H's to consonants, and he's like, I don't do that. And people who were doing it inconsistently and wrongly were they were getting it wrong. And that's what he's making fun of here. So what's going on here? Why can we have nemo, but we also have nihil and nihilum? And the short answer is that this sound is, the voiceless glottal fricative is not exactly a strong consonant sound. Latin also doesn't even consider it, the Latin grammarians don't think of it as a consonant proper either, because they associate it with the rough breathing, which is just a little mark put over in over vowels in Greek in order to represent the h sound. And just like Greek, Latin elides right through the H as if it's not even there. And elision, or rather synalefi, the blending of vowels between words, is something that we'll talk about quite extensively in the future. This is more just talking about, like, is the H pronounced? Yes. But then what do we do practically? Because, of course, this is always about the practical. I'm always been interested in the practical. The theory is very interesting. The data and the evidence are compelling. So if you want to pronounce the H as Cicero and Catullus and Quintilian and many others, then, of course, it ought to be pronounced. So we have nihil, which comes from nihilum, but then we also have the contraction nil. It's simply a contraction, like the word can't in English, right? Can't is from cannot, or even cannot. I would assume the stress would be on the not. But if cannot, like we have, maybe we'll just say it's cannot, cannot. So does that mean that the vowel in the word not is just a schwa? Cannot. And that's why it can become can't? No, that's not what's going on. Contractions are really fun and interesting things, and it doesn't mean that there's a complete you don't need to have something that already is that way in order for it to exist. For example, the same fallacy that people claim, well, all Romance languages have the, which isn't true, as I've demonstrated in the letter V video, that there are, of course, at least there's at least three significant groups of Romance languages in Italy where there's still wa, which is Corsican, many parts of Lazio, and also in Montellese, which is in Campania. So there's still some isolated places, reasonably isolated, where it's the va is still a wa. And exactly how it got that way is interesting. But it's demonstrative that, no, not all Romance languages have a fricative for the letter V. So even if it did, it doesn't mean, like the Romance languages for the most part have lost the case system. Does that mean Latin didn't use the case system? Because that's the conclusion. These are the false conclusions that lead to the belief that there was an underlanguage, a vulgar Latin, which had to be fully developed underneath this artificial classical Latin. Those are all fallacies. So this is all sort of part and parcel with those fallacies. So mihi becoming me. I mean, in English we pronounce the H. Certainly in my dialect of English, in General American, I pronounce H quite normally, but something like got him instead of got him, yeah, or like did you see her? So did you see her? Did you see her? I mean, this you becomes ya, gets reduced. Did you see her? Did you see her? If I pronounce the H on that, did you see her? It's unusual, and it's rather emphatic. It's not impossible, but I don't recommend it for native-sounding English. Did you see her? I could say, did you see her? Or like, did you see her? Did you see him? That would be okay. And the point is that, look, we have an H between vowels. Did you see him? The H between vowels. Nemo, nehomo. And nihil, nihilum, nihilum into nihil becoming nil, mihi, mi. These are contractions. And the point that we can definitely take from mihi as well is that it's used by poets if they need, for example, the two syllables. Mi is used if the one long syllable is better. So the issue is that the H is pronounced. You could say mi as a two-syllable word, mi, instead of mihi. But mi phonetically sounds identical to me anyway if we're pronouncing it without the H sound. So the H is there. To say it's completely silent is just false. It's for some speakers maybe. So what do we do with something like this, like multo honore, multo honore? We'll have to talk about this in more detail when we get to vowel junction stuff, like in the leafy and elisions and all that. But practically speaking, I just like when I say, did you see her? I say multo onore, multo onore. I don't force an H sound here. I do the same thing with final M, as you may know. Multo onore. Now I could say multo honore. Did you see her? Did you see him? Those are okay. Multo honore. I create a hiatus, a hiatus in between the two vowel sounds, which is technically a barbarism, but is talked about as something that's done like just for clarity and emphasis. Certain grammarians go into that. So, what about something like this? Veru sonos, veru sonos, veru sonos. Now you could pronounce the H in there if you wanted. Verus honos. But the point is that since H doesn't make position, take position, doesn't make position. That is to say, which is just bizarre terminology that you don't need to know. H does not act like a consonant. For example, verus labor. Verus labor, long, short. The la is short. The ho is also short. But here, verusonos, the us and the ho, these are both short syllables because the h might as well not even be there when it comes to the weight or length of the syllable. Verus. So this is uso, uso. It's either with an h sound, uso, or not, uso. But you can hear how light that is. Uso, uso. It's almost like there's no... I can perceive what I'm doing it, but it's a very weak sound, just like, did you see her? Did you see him? Now, when I say that to a native English speaker, did you see her? Did you see him? Anyone would normally transcribe that, did you see her, him, writing out the full word. We perceive H's that we're not actually pronouncing because they are still in the, they're still part of the language because he, him, her. I don't say e, im. I say he, her, him in those positions. Thus, H after a pause, honore. But if it's not after a pause, I tend to allow it to go silent. Now, a little bit on these guys. So Greek, essentially Greek words. Greek words where we have this H added in. Karta, thermai, pilosopous. That's how I usually pronounce them, but there are other options. The most important thing is that the H on a consonant, just like Cicero is saying over here, is not something that is normal for him, or probably for any native speaker of Latin, because it's not to say carta instead of simply carta, or thermai instead of thermai, or instead of saying pilosopous, they would say pilosopous, which is the pa, an unaspirated pa. And I talked about that in a previous thing, how to deaspirate. So before we can even talk about aspirating consonants in the Greek fashion, ka, ta, pa, we have to get good at not aspirating. And for native English speakers or German speakers, for example, take a look at that video because I talk about whispering, the whisper method, the whisper drive. It's an Archer reference. Okay, so carta. Would we actually say carta in Latin? Do we want to say carta? Because this is talked about as something that is done, I think we certainly can. It's part of the orthography of the language, so it's put there for a reason. Just like we have these u in like prugum, right? Prugum, prugum, and pjursum. We have the h there because it's a voiceless r, like I talked about in the row video on polymathy, right? So we can affect these Greek things, but it's probably the norm if we're speaking quickly is just to talk about multam cartabeo. Multa, multa, a lot of paper. Multam carta. Multam cartabeo. Multam cartabeo. And there I'm pronouncing it essentially multam cartabeo. Multam cartabeo. That's phonetically more or less how I'm pronouncing it. Multam cartabeo. Now that doesn't mean that carta couldn't exist even in popular speech, but they would just reduce it. But more interesting here, of course, is how the M and the H, it's like they're not even there. Multam cartabeo. We can add a nasal, cartabeo, add a little bit of nasalization to it. I generally don't bother. Because one of the reasons too is that this ma and multam, because nga is sort of a ka, right? It's not multam cartam. Multam cartam. It's assimilated. If we're not doing some kind of weird hiatus, the way a lot of, say, ecclesiastical pronunciation Italians might pronounce, say, multam cartam abeo. Lovely. I don't mind it. It's just not a representation of the language when it's spoken natively. Just as we would say, did you see her? Instead of did you see her? Like that second one is highly emphatic. It's not wrong. It's just not how anybody actually talks. 99.9% of the time. Multam cartabeo. Multam cartabeo. So whether or not you want to aspirate carta or not would be whether or not you would want to imitate certain things. Like as you probably know, I added the, like say, whether or what. I've added that voiceless hua back into my own speech just because I think it's fun. And if I can do carta instead of carta and so forth, I figure I could do it in English. But that's just my thing. That's just for fun. Also, I like to do it with my reconstructed Shakespearean pronunciation. So it's kind of practice, but you know. So whether or not you want to do this or just ignore it completely is up to you. I think most native Latin speakers of the classical period are ignoring them and not saying termai. Maybe they're saying termai, but if they're speaking in rapid speech, they'll say termai. Like it's not even there. And philosophus instead of philosophus. And that's the next thing. Now, these consonants, there's some practical aspects. Saying philosophus is not going to be easily understood if you're talking about philosophia instead of philosophia, or even philosophia bilabial fricative, or philosophia. There's an obvious practical reason for at least pronouncing PH as an F. I get it. I know why people want to do that. And by the 2nd century AD, there's significant evidence that's at least a fricative, because we have people, grammarians, trying to correct, and pronunciations where we see spelling errors. I think there's a 2nd century Phoenix inscription, and there's a Phoenix with an F, and it should be with a Phoenix, right? What's interesting too is that I think it's actually might be an I don't remember, but the point is that the diphthong is retained. It's not an E or an E. So what's interesting is that it's a Latin inscription, but this is a Greek word. Why would it change to an F sound? Well, because it's changed to something closer to an F. It's changed to some kind of a fricative, bilabial fricative, fa. That's how I do it in the Lucian pronunciation, because those aspects, those characteristics are already occurring even by the late Republican Roman era. So we have, so to say something like philosophus, in my opinion, is not out of the question. But that would be a Roman who's extremely good at pronouncing that fa, that bilabial fricative, which is not in Latin. Or may have been in some version of Old Latin, for the F might have represented fa. There's some evidence that Old Spanish also had retained that, but we'll get into that. So if you want to pronounce this as a fa, because a Roman's not going to be able to do a fa natively. They would do a fa. Fa would be a pronunciation. We learned a pronunciation. But we're polyglots, right? We know at least English and Latin, and maybe some Greek. So if we're affecting these pronunciation things, it's not totally uncalled for. Maybe. Though it's definitely an artificial way of working with it. The th sound was coming into the later part of the classical period. So thermai, charta. It's an interesting thing too. The Cherusci tribe, which is, of course, they're featured in the show Barbarians. This initial H is etymologically connected to the H in the English word heart, meaning a female deer. So in this, because this is a Proto-Germanic stage of the language, it was a cha. So Cherusci was almost really Cherusci, not Cherusci, but they spelled it with a CH in the late Republican period, or at least in the end of the 1st century BC, so early Imperial. Cherusci is probably how it was actually pronounced, Cherusci, but Romans wouldn't be able to say Cherusci, they would say Cherusci, because they would hear a cha, and they would be like, ha. They would say either Cherusci, or they would say Cherusci, because it would be a cha. So... which is an interesting possibility as well, that indeed that saying charta may be totally fine even for all of the classical Latin period. So on the consonants, probably not just ignoring the H is the most natural thing to do. At least that's what Cicero, he doesn't per se recommend it, triumpus and so forth, especially on the Latin words. Foreign words, it's different. You're saying Carthaginem instead of Carthaginem. But triumpus, why would that have an H on it? Or would sepulchrum have an H on it? And Sidney Allen goes into some aspects of it. I don't disagree with his conclusions. Practically speaking, I generally ignore those H's. But on a vowel, I keep the H. So like vehementer. They added the H because they're pronouncing it. Vehementer. If it's from a Y, I think it's from Y. Y becomes we. This is another interesting example of how I becomes E. Certainly in older times in Latin, even though the I is retained for the vast majority, oi is retained for the vast majority of speakers in classical Latin, it had monophthong I's for certain speakers to give us certain characteristics of classical Latin that we take for granted as just being normal. So are some people not pronouncing the H, and some people weren't pronouncing the H? Which, I mean, look at English. In American English we say herb, in British English they say herb. I can say we say, no, I'm not British. Herb, herb, but a lot of people say human. Some people say human. Instead of saying Hadrian, they say Adrian. I remember having a teacher in high school correct me and say it's not human, it's human, and it's not Hadrian, it's Adrian. He's from Pennsylvania, as far as I recall. Maybe he's from New England. Correcting me, and I was, shocked at the time. I obviously didn't take his advice. That's human and Adrian, what a bizarre thing. But that for him, that was correct. Great. So for some people, those kinds of pronunciations are obviously correct. So if you're not one to use the H at all in Latin, I think it's credible to say that some Latin speakers were not pronouncing it anywhere. On consonants, probably not at all. But on vowels, yeah. When you have something like bruto onore or verus, where'd it go? Verusonos. The key is to keep the syllables short. And we'll talk more about syllable length stuff in the future. I have some public videos on that, but we'll go into more detail on exactly how to do all of that. But I think that's enough for now. Pronounce your H's in Latin as much as you like, and you'll be good.